want to talk about what does embodied musicality in musical learning actually mean? And this is a philosophical paper. It's badged as that such. I do have a degree with philosophy in the title, so I thought now and then I would like to sort of air it and demonstrate it. So a lot of this is thinking and problematizing and creating issues. A lot of this is English, so I'm terribly sorry for people for whom the English context is foreign, because and I appreciate that we all make assumptions, but I'll be talking about England, and can I just say England is not Britain. So it's very specific. And we hear a lot about the notion of embodiment in music education, but I've been wondering, what does this mean for learners, and especially learners in the context of an OMI event, whose bodies might be different? So what does embodiment mean? And like I say, I want to present some of the arguments and do a bit of problematizing, and I'll be using a few juicy quotes from the literature to do this. And one of the interesting things about this is the idea of what does embodiment mean in terms of being a human being. And this sounds a bit sort of deep and meaningful, especially when you've just had a gut full of sandwiches. But there's an awful lot to be thinking about in terms of what do we think of in terms of the person. And I hate to take you too far back to Descartes, but the idea of Cartesian dualism runs very heavily in this. And this is the idea where knowledge is an object, which Gary Spruce talked about this being haunted by the metaphysical spectre of Cartesian dualism. So where there are two modes, the mind and the body, the two things. And Gary says this distinction between these two modes has perhaps weighed more heavily on music than any of the other art forms. And for us in the context of this conference, that matters. So thinking about music education, do we in music education perceive a sort of Cartesian dualism? Have we got this mind-body split? We've seen lots of interesting videos this morning. What does this mean about young people who might be musical in their minds, but can't embody it in a conventional musical instrument? What does it mean for those children? Do we think this is a different form of musicality? And I struggle with words. Do we think this is a different form of musicality from the non-differently abled? What do we think musicality is? And then there's the question that I always ask in these, so who are we? So when I say we, who are we? What are we doing? Let's get really deep. Let's do Merleau-Ponty versus Descartes. And so Merleau-Ponty is convinced the body is not an object in the objective sense. The body is the subject of action, and Merleau-Ponty talks about it being a pre-conscious subject that possesses both intentionality and knowledge. The experience of things in the world is lived from an embodied point of view. The subject is a perceiving body, situated in time and immersed in the living world. And so Merleau-Ponty treats the body as a subject rather than the object, saying that our bodies are part of our subjectivity. And I know you think this sounds awfully deep. What are you talking about this for, Martin? Because I think for an OMI conference it matters, because we're often concerned about bodies. So where is musicality located? So Wayne Bowman has said musical learning is not so much a matter of what one knows as who one becomes. I'm not reading all the words on all these slides. You're very welcome to go and dig around in libraries afterwards. But he said the implications of this corporally rooted, culturally constructed identity are momentous. Bodily constituted identity is no take it or leave it affair, but a fundamental component of selfhood and cultural belonging. And I think in the context of this conference, that matters. Bodily constituted identity is really what we're here to talk about. And so Wayne goes on to say that about corporeal schemata extending to the heart of who we are, both biologically and culturally, and then skilled musical performance. That's one of the things that OMI talks about, undifferentiated musical performance. The biological and the cultural are linked because we have very careful thinking about what does high-level musicality mean. And we've heard a lot about that this morning. So music making, Juntunen this time, a bodily and embodied practice in which emotions, thought, and bodily actions are unified. And as we know, music is produced by physical movement. What happens, as I keep asking throughout this, when we're thinking about the placing of different embodiments depending on the person who is doing the embodying? So how does it work depending on the body, and as Juntunen says, rather than on the harmony or functionality of the body and mind? I can see Victoria in the room. Some years ago, we looked at whole class ensemble tuition, which is what WCET means, and we found out about issues where children who didn't have the full use of both upper limbs were excluded, essentially, from many forms of whole class ensemble tuition at the time we looked at it. Bearing in mind it's 2017, and things have happened since then. But there was a simplistic reaction of, this kid can't do that particular music session, take them away and do something else with them. So there was a notion of exclusion in terms of what children can do and the ways in which they are able to do it. So we were finding that out then. So Lycan in 2009 then talked about the idea of what's going on and how neuroscience and materialism does this. The mental does not seem physical in any way at all, much less neurophysiological. So what is going on in the mind and how is it taking place? And we've heard again about the social model of disability, but as Samaha says, deciding how to respond to disability in law and culture, and for me that's the important bit here, depends on a normative framework that cannot be supplied by the model. Because we're thinking about music and culture as well as law, fine, but music is also a cultural phenomenon. And there's all sorts of things that we want to think about in terms of how that works. A bit of history. The Bentley test of musical ability, which you may or may not remember, and if you're not English, you probably won't know anything about. But when my PhD was essentially about assessment and classroom music, which I did last century, which is now a long time ago, one of the first questions I was asked many times over the first few years afterwards was, why don't you just reconfigure the Bentley test for today? If you don't know what the Bentley test is, don't really have time to go into it, but there is this video may or may not work.
Test number 2, tunes. For each item, 2 tunes will be played, like this. The tune is the same as the first, as that was, write S. If the second tune is not the same as the first, one note will have been changed. Listen to this example and count the notes as they are played. In the second tune, the third note is changed, and you would write the figure 3.
And there's reams of that, if you remember it. And when I first started teaching such a long time ago, the Bentley test record existed in the music department, and you played it on a vinyl record player. If you ever experienced what a school vinyl record player was like, when it came to pitch differentiation, it's going wow, 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 and it's the same note. So there's a lot of issues. But I've wondered for a long time, has that mentality persisted? Do we still think of musical ability solely up here, and we try and test for it? So do we still conceptualize that thing that Bentley, back in those days, I'm not looking at the Bentley test, because at the time, that's what we knew. But do we think perception is more or less only in the mind? Is musicality only up here? But we do have to hear it as well, don't we? So there is some sort of physicality going on. So what is going on? The late, great Janet Mills wrote in 1984 The evidence presented suggested the publication of a new musical ability test that reflects technological developments is overdue. And when I was preparing this, I thought I had one of those moments. 1984 was 41 years ago, so which made me feel very old indeed. What do we think musical ability is nowadays? How do we conceptualize musical ability? And how should we, can we, might we test for it? And why should we be testing for it? What are we doing if we're doing this? Because people still keep saying to me, we need something like this. And why? Because I have trouble with thinking of what the Bentley test is measuring. And there's a whole research, you don't need me to tell you about it. If you're English, you'll know about knowledge-rich schools. Nick Gibb, who I can't say without wanting a dartboard with his face in the middle of it, was a strong proponent of knowledge-based learning and supported the pedagogical view that emphasising knowledge over skills improved pupil outcomes and school standards. And in Schools Week, one teacher said, Gibb sold us on the promise of more knowledge, but what children actually take home is often eviscerated of the very things that have made it worthwhile. And there's a real issue with that. So I've got nearly 7.5 minutes left, so time for a quick anecdote. One of the things I do quite a bit is talk to teachers about assessment. And I was talking to teachers about assessment once, and in the coffee break, all the interesting conversations happened. A teacher said to me, I really need to talk to you, Martin. I teach in a knowledge-rich school. This is a secondary school teacher, so that's age 11 to 14, if you're not British. I got told off for doing singing, because singing is a skill, and we are a knowledge-rich school. And I got told, and I felt like saying, if you're singing with year 9, I'd give you a medal. I wouldn't be saying to you, don't do it, because it's not knowledge. But this is the situation we have ended up with in some places, where we get this knowledge-rich being prioritised and other things being downgraded. Chris Philpott has talked about when music is characterised as being self-evidently good for us, then you get issues with wider inequalities and structural injustices, and we're not allowed to critique it. It's just taken as music is good for you. Chris Philpott has argued it's not always the case. So it's another long quote from Wayne Bowman that we've accepted uncritically notions of knowing and understanding crafted in other domains. And before I was an academic, I was a school music teacher, and I can safely say school music teachers are near the bottom of the hierarchy when it comes to arguing about cognitive domains in school. And so it really is the case of do this because the maths and the science people say this is the way to do it. And that's not the case. And Wayne Bowman has said they're inadequate for the subjects that they come from, and they're definitely most inadequate for music. Our most revered justifications of music education are built upon deeply flawed notions about mind, cognition, and intelligence. And I think for us in this context, that really matters. So in school music lessons, and I'm thinking particularly about school classroom music here, notions of musicality often proceed with skills and knowledge running hand in hand. But what does it mean when there's only one hand? And that really, really troubles me. So in other words, what is it to be musical? How is it demonstrated, and how do we know it exists? And I'm always drawn to Ludlow's challenge, which says if it exists, it can be measured. If it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. And I'm drawn to it because here's another dartboard moment as far as I'm concerned. But I'm not convinced that's the case. But there's a mentality that says that is the case. And there's a mentality in schools that says that's the case. So what does it mean for OMI? So if musical learning is not just cognitive, so in other words, if we can lay the ghost of Cartesian dualism, but along with Merleau-Ponty says involves the body as well, what does it mean for embodied learning in the whole class ensemble tuition classroom when we've got kids who are part of OMI's constituency? And what does it mean anywhere else when we think about musical learning? So you will be very pleased to hear that this is, apart from the references, but you won't want to read those, this is the final slide. And it says, do we need a more thorough philosophical and practical stance as to what knowledge and knowing, and I've separated those deliberately, involves in music education? What is the role of embodiment in this? And what does inclusion mean when we think about musicality? And that takes us to the really big questions like, what does it mean to be musical? What is ability? And there's a problem with that word. Is it able-ability? What is musical ability? And what about musical unability or disability? What do we think of those? And then, maybe this is particularly a British thing, is being musical solely about performance from the public perception? Is that what people think? So there's the references should you wish to go and do some homework. Thank you very much.
I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues and co-authors Matthew Wright and Tim Yates, Southampton and Drake Music, respectively. What I do in my own work is basically instrument design. That's the research lab that I run. I'm not going to actually present you any sort of designs or instruments today as such, so this is going to be a bunch of boring talking about philosophy, so please bear with me. What we wanted to talk about was this idea of taxonomy, of essentially classification of accessible musical instruments. Basically, the question is this a valuable thing to do for accessible instruments, and if so, why? So why might we classify accessible instruments? It might be useful to make some sort of sense of all of the many things that are out there in the world as a way of informing discussions, maybe as a way of helping musicians or teachers identify instruments, or maybe suggest ones that don't yet exist, things that might exist in the future. And so there's a number of reasons why I think the work that OMI does and other organizations to kind of bring this sort of work together can be extremely valuable. Now, but then having said that, essentially the question of how to classify or taxonomize instruments immediately becomes really problematic. Should we do this in a hierarchical fashion? What goes at the top of the hierarchy? What goes further down? Or should we maybe take some cues from Deleuze and do a more rhizomatic approach, a kind of many to many roots? Should our classification be centered on physical objects, or should it be centered on people, the players? Should it be analytic, based on certain kinds of properties that we might sort of discover in an instrument, or should it be more pragmatic, just based on our experience? Whenever you end up talking about musical instruments and classification systems, you always end up back at Mr. Hornbostel and Sachs, who more than 100 years ago now presented this particular classification system of mainly acoustic musical instruments, which itself supplanted something even earlier. This is a hierarchical classification, a tree structure essentially based on the physical mechanisms by which instruments produce sound. Do they produce sound by strings, by membranes, by air columns, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, this has been updated or proposed to be updated many times. In 1937, Galpin proposed electrophones as a new category of sound production. I mean, we can have sort of digiphones, I suppose, when we get to the digital instrument space. Anyway, this has been used by a number of organizations, including the Musical Instrument Museum Online. Now, Thor Magnusson, who's written a lot of extremely interesting things around instrument taxonomy, talks about the work that attempts to add digital instruments to existing organological classifications. They tend to include the word towards in the title, as the authors typically acknowledge that these are only the first steps toward newer improved organology, but the journey often ends there. Busted. We titled our presentation, and then we came across this, and yeah, Thor is right. Our journey will not get all the way to the end of our classification system either. But a key issue here has to do with the culture of the knowledge that is supposedly being classified. And, oops, what's going to happen here? Oh no. Why did that happen? Okay. Sorry, I've now lost my screen here. Where's minutes? Okay, fine. And that basically the Hornbostel-Sachs system itself supplanted something earlier that was taken to be too Eurocentric, as a result of which basically they were trying to remove the culture from the classification by focusing on the sort of physical means of sound production. Now, a question is that a reasonable thing to do? And is it actually possible or useful to sort of deculturate musical instruments? I think that takes us back then to this question about, what are we trying to do here anyway? What's, aside from an academic exercise, what's interesting about classifying instruments? Well, probably it's because we want to, in some manner, either learn something about the instruments or help to navigate a space of possible current or future instruments. So there's been a few attempts at exactly this. A.D. Dickens has published a scheme called FAME, Facilitating Access to Musical Experiences, focused particularly on digital instruments, looking at a few different factors. For example, things like durability, how robust is this instrument? Flexibility, how adaptable is it to different situations? Practicality, how quickly can one set this up? The actual practical conditions of use are, of course, are extremely important. Complexity, if you think about this from a sort of user interface point of view, drawing on human-computer interaction, you get to these kinds of questions. And then compatibility, which has to do potentially with the fact that this instrument might be incorporated into a setup that somebody already has for varying reasons. And also, could this then interface with other kinds of technology, like assistive technologies? If you want to know more about this, accessibleinstruments.org and is interesting, and there's a whole PhD thesis about this as well. We could talk more generally about this idea of a player-centered approach to classifying instruments. And I think the essential point here is that the accessibility or non-accessibility of an instrument is fundamentally relational. Because even the idea that something is a musical instrument is essentially relational. A clicky pen can be a musical instrument under the right circumstances. This desk can be a musical instrument. Something that sits in a display case unable to make sound is actually, that could be a museum piece that is in some ways no longer a musical instrument. And so, just as instrumentality is a sort of relational property of people and things, so too is accessibility, obviously. An instrument accessible to one person is not accessible to another. Every person is different. And I think to this, we also really need to add the important point of repertoire, which came up in the panel discussion this morning. Instruments are accessible perhaps for certain repertoire, not for others. The problem I think that this leads to in terms of classification systems is if you want to classify in a player-centered way, this tends to take you in a space of classifying particular categories of disability, which I guess the WHO does have certain kinds of sort of schemata for this sort of thing, but I think it's a bit of a fraught space, and I think there's a real risk of being very reductive, and ultimately that might not serve any of the ends that we originally set out to achieve. You also end up with language issues around attempting to classify things in this way because, for example, if you talk about limb difference versus hemiplegia, will one find the right things when they go searching for things? And, do these things mean the same? No, they probably don't. The overlaps are complex. So, what's to be done about this? Well, there's been a few different approaches, not specifically to do with accessible instruments, but Thor Magnusson again has proposed this notion of musical organics, which he proposes to be a quote hierarchical approach to digital organology. His system has essentially three different tiers, none sort of at a higher hierarchical level than the other. One is traditional classification systems like our Horn, Bossel, and Sachs. The other could be to consider essentially a more decentralized approach, user contributions, a so-called folksonomy. But then also we could go beyond this notion of metadata tags and classification trees toward maybe particular analyses of actual musical content. Thor, being a digital instrument researcher, is of course also interested in the contributions of machine systems, machine listening, potentially even to bring different perspectives to what is being done with instruments. And it's also not necessarily required that this is navigated like a traditional database or like some sort of traditional tree structure. There's many different ways that such information could be proposed. So if we were to do such a thing, I guess then sort of the question that follows is, what are we even looking for in an instrument? What should we care about? Maybe we care about sonic properties of instruments, things like pitch and dynamics, timbre, that very problematic word that sort of means everything that's left over when you've dealt with pitch and dynamics. articulation in terms of, well, I mean, how do you ultimately make an instrument speak? How do you get from here to here? How kind of nimbly, or with, with what kinds of qualities can you do that? That's actually extremely important. We could also be thinking about physical properties of instruments. We could be thinking about how big are they? How much do they weigh? How portable are they? What do they look like? We could think about what does it mean to the player? Playing techniques. What kinds of bodies essentially is this instrument well suited for? What kinds of accessories might broaden its accessibility, and for whom? Of course, it's really important in any system where we're interested ultimately in facilitating access to instruments. We have to realize that we exist within a certain kind of economic society where things like how much does it cost matters, and even government policy that VAT is charged on certain things but not on other things, and how you consider them to be classified might actually affect that. Can you actually buy it? Can you acquire it? That is a real issue for a lot of things, even with the best will in the world. And then I think ultimately, the relationality of accessible instruments to existing familiar forms is complex and important. Is this, can this accessible instrument be said to be an adapted version of this other instrument? Does that slot into all of the kind of musical scenarios in which that other instrument might be played? Can it be played in a similar way? Does it emulate its sound? Can it be substituted in an ensemble? I mean, we've seen, a number of examples of this already today. And I mean, and this is like, 1% of the kinds of questions that you might ask. So, at some level, right? I mean, it's, how are we to even decide? How are we to make sense? And is there any, kind of true and real and kind of best way of systematizing this? And, here, I love this little excerpt from Borges where he talks about, so it's this kind of response to somebody in I think the 18th century, who was proposing a kind of language system that was fundamentally logical. And, he proposes this notion, surely apocryphal, this, Franz Kuhn attributes to a certain Chinese encyclopedia entitled Celestial Empire of Benevolent Knowledge. In its remote pages, it is written that the animals are divided into belonging to the emperor, embalmed, tamed, suckling pigs, sirens, fabulous, stray dogs, included in the present classification, frenzied, innumerable, drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, etc., having just broken the water pitcher, and that finally, that from a long way off look like flies. But why not, right? Why not? It's a classification. There are many possible classifications, and essentially, who are we to say that this is not reasonable for some particular fictional or possibly real time and place? And Borges continues in this little article that he says it's clear that there's no classification of the universe not being arbitrary and full of conjectures. The reason for this is very simple. We do not know what thing the universe is. For me, it kind of suggests that there's a fine line between classification and what we might call reification. Basically this idea, a sort of fallacy wherein the quote, the rules used in the formulation of behavior must be the very same rules which produce that behavior. You can look at the world, you can make certain kinds of conjectures, but it doesn't mean that that the system you've come up with is explanatory of why that stuff was there to begin with. I think reification is actually a really big problem, particularly in music technology, and I'll spare you a much longer rant about that. But just to say that the problem with these kind of reified notions, here quoting Dylan Vanderschiff, is that it assumes music to be an objective thing rather than an interactive, relational, multimodal activity. And then it also basically tends to reinforce ingrained cultural ideologies. So, I mean, just to give you some examples of this, in the troubles of classifying, where does a digital piano fit in a classification system? Does it belong next to acoustic pianos? Hornbostel wouldn't say so, and yet, for basically every sort of player-centered view, it does, except maybe if you're Sarah, and then it probably doesn't really work the same way in terms of you playing inside the piano on the strings. Well, it's not going to happen. The Linstrument. OMI uses this in certain kinds of situations where a violin might be called for because, it can ultimately produce a credible way of playing violin sounding things controlled by MIDI. Is the instrument taken to be the same thing as its sound? Is that, how far do we go with that? Or the Miu Miu gloves, used for a wide variety of different things. Is this a controller? Is this an instrument? Is it an object? We could have a long debate about those terms. Is this an adapted instrument? If so, what exactly is it adapting? Or, to go back to the one-handed piano example from the morning, we don't need a special piano. Maybe my question in the morning notwithstanding, that the piano can be one-handed, the piano can be two-handed. It just depends on what you're playing, really. And then oops, no, what's going on? Okay. And then the piano, of course, has many variations. Does it matter what kind of pedals it has? Does that change its accessibility status? Maybe not. Turns out. I thought that was very interesting, actually. Yeah, so thank you for that. But you end up with all sorts of issues. I mean, if you search for one-handed in something like this, you don't actually find any results. But does that mean there aren't any instruments that can be played with one hand? Well, no. Probably it just means that it isn't written in those terms. It isn't taken to be a sort of an intrinsic property of the instrument at all. So maybe then, what we need to do is focus more on the who. Who is taxonomizing? Why are they taxonomizing? Are these taxonomies a thing at all? Is it just imposed? Or is there some sort of underlying truth? And this idea of whether this particular object, this particular instrument is taken to be an adapted version of this other thing surely depends on who's asking, the maker, the player, in what contexts. Basically, is anyone really authorized to speak kind of in an authoritative manner about the compatibility of people, instruments, and musical situations? Maybe this ought to be delegated more widely. And ultimately, these accessibility standards, when are they helpful, but when do they become overly reductive? So basically, I'm just raising lots of problems more than necessarily saying how it ought to be done. But one consequence of that is maybe that there's a word that shouldn't be in the title of this slide. Towards taxonomy of accessible instruments, maybe as a thing we do, rather than as some sort of thing where ultimately you've solved it, you've come up with the answer. There's your taxonomy. Good. Bye now. There are various examples of organizations that are enacting these kinds of taxonomies, or taxonomy as a process. OMI being an excellent example with OMI Connect, where there are ways of discovering instruments, probably mainly from a player-centered direction. And that essentially it's not just about a set of symbolic relationships that's on a website. It's about all of the work that comes around OMI, about finding these instruments, working with people on them, speculating about what could exist, making them available. All of this is part of the taxonomic activity. Drake Music also has a project of its own, which if Tim were here, he could tell you more about, called AMIC, the Accessible Musical Instrument Collection. This will eventually be a place where people can actually have hands-on contact in a particular venue to come try out instruments, potentially take them away to use them. That too is a form of enacted taxonomy. So essentially, maybe then this talk really should be about doing taxonomy of accessible musical instruments, and maybe something that we all do in our own particular ways. Thank you.